There are few brands that feel more American than 7-Eleven. The bright orange, green, and red sign, the fluorescent lights, the hot dogs rotating behind the glass, the enormous cups of soda, and, of course, the Slurpee. For generations of Americans, a trip to 7-Eleven has been almost meaningless in its familiarity. You stop in for a drink, maybe some chips, maybe gas, maybe something you absolutely did not intend to buy. It feels less like visiting a company and more like visiting a piece of America. But there is something strange about that image, because 7-Eleven isn't really an American company anymore. Today, 7-Eleven Inc. is wholly owned by 7&I Holdings, the Japanese retail group behind 7-Eleven Japan. The company now operates more than 86,000 stores across 19 countries and regions. And that isn't even the strangest part, because the Japanese company that eventually took control of 7-Eleven didn't invent the convenience store. It didn't even start the company. It was originally just a licensee. In fact, the entire story begins almost a century ago with something that sounds completely unrelated to convenience stores: ice. And the more you look into 7-Eleven's history, the stranger the story gets. Because the company that pioneered convenience retail in America eventually nearly destroyed itself with a massive leveraged buyout. Then, after the company collapsed into bankruptcy, its own Japanese licensee stepped in to rescue it. The student had effectively become the teacher. And eventually, the teacher became the owner. This is the true story of how 7-Eleven went from a small ice house in Dallas to one of the largest retail brands on earth, and how the supposedly all-American convenience store ended up being saved, rebuilt, and ultimately owned by Japan. To understand 7-Eleven, you have to forget about convenience stores for a moment, because in 1927, there was no 7-Eleven. There wasn't even a convenience store industry. There was the Southland Ice Company. The company operated ice houses in Dallas, Texas, at a time when refrigeration was nowhere near as universal as it is today. People needed ice. And one of the company's employees, Jefferson Green, better known as Uncle Johnny, had an idea. If customers were already coming to the ice house, why not sell them some of the other things they needed? Bread, milk, eggs, and other basic household products. It was a simple idea, but it changed retail. Instead of making customers wait for the grocery store to open, the ice house could provide basic necessities when they needed them. Southland's president, Joe C. Thompson Jr., recognized the potential and began expanding the idea to other locations. The stores became known as totem stores, and suddenly, the company wasn't just selling ice anymore, it was selling convenience. The concept was almost ridiculously simple. Put useful things close to where people live. Keep the store open when other stores are closed. And make the transaction as fast and painless as possible. That sounds obvious now, but that is precisely because companies like 7-Eleven helped make it obvious. Southland expanded rapidly. In 1933, Prohibition ended, allowing the stores to sell beer and liquor, which helped accelerate their growth. By 1937, Southland was taking the convenience store idea to other ice stocks, and the number of locations carrying groceries and everyday products had multiplied. Then came the name that would eventually become one of the most recognizable logos in the world. In 1946, Southland changed the name from Totem Stores to 7-Eleven. Why? Because the stores were open from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m., 7 days a week. At the time, those hours were extraordinary. Today, we take late-night retail for granted. Back then, a store that stayed open until 11 p.m. was making a very different promise. You don't have to plan your life around the store. The store will adapt to your life. That idea would become the foundation of the entire company, and eventually, 7-Eleven would push it even further. By 1963, The company had opened its 1,000th store, and one location near the University of Texas in Austin started staying open all night to accommodate students. It worked. The experiment spread. 24-hour convenience became part of the brand. And this is where 7-Eleven's real genius begins to emerge. It wasn't simply selling products, it was selling time. The grocery store asked you to plan, the department store asked you to browse. The convenience store asked you to walk in, get what you need, and leave. And the faster American life became, the more valuable that idea became. But 7-Eleven was about to discover something even more important. The best convenience stores don't just sell things people need, they sell things people suddenly want. By the 1960s and 70s, 7-Eleven had become much more than an ice company with groceries attached. It had become a retail laboratory, and some of its most important products weren't invented by some genius executive sitting in a boardroom. They came from observing customers. Take coffee. In 1964, 7-Eleven became the first retailer to sell fresh brewed coffee in to-go cups. That sounds almost laughably normal today, but at the time, fresh coffee was something people generally drank at home or in restaurants. 7-Eleven effectively turned coffee into something you could grab on the way somewhere else. Then came the product that would become inseparable from the brand, the Slurpee. The story is almost absurdly accidental. In the mid-1960s, a 7-Eleven employee saw a frozen drink machine and believed it could sell. The company tested just 3 machines. The experiment worked so well that 7-Eleven quickly ordered another 100. By 1967, the frozen drink machines were appearing throughout the chain, and the company needed a name. The name Slurpee reportedly came from the sound the drink made while being sucked through a straw. It was silly, which was exactly the point. 7-Eleven didn't try to make the product sound sophisticated. It made it sound fun, and that mattered, because the Slurpee wasn't really solving a problem. Nobody needed a Slurpee. It was an impulse, a little reward, something you bought because you happened to walk into the store. And that was an incredibly important development. The convenience store had discovered that convenience could be profitable even when the customer wasn't actually shopping for necessities. Then came another product that pushed the idea even further, the Big Gulp. In 1976, 7-Eleven introduced a 32-ounce fountain drink. At the time, that was enormous. The original Big Gulp cup was shaped almost like a milk carton, and the product was such a success that it dramatically increased the company's fountain drink business. Think about what 7-Eleven was doing. Ice, coffee, frozen drinks, huge sodas, hot food, gas, snacks, basic groceries. It was slowly turning the convenience store into a place where almost anything could happen. And the company was learning one of the most important rules in retail. If you make something easy enough to buy, people will buy things they never planned to buy. That was the real 7-Eleven business model. Not simply convenience, impulse. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, 7-Eleven had become one of the defining retail brands of American life. But while the American stores were becoming culturally iconic, something fascinating was happening on the other side of the Pacific. Japan had discovered 7-Eleven, and the Japanese version of the company was about to become something much more important than anyone in Dallas expected. In 1973, Southland made a deal that looked like a normal international expansion opportunity. A Japanese retailer called Ito-Yokado wanted to bring the 7-Eleven concept to Japan. Southland granted the company a license to develop 7-Eleven stores there. A new company called York 7 was established in November 1973. The first Japanese 7-Eleven opened in Tokyo in May 1974, and almost immediately, the Japanese operation started doing things differently. The Japanese stores weren't simply American stores with Japanese signs. They adapted the convenience store model to Japanese customers. The company introduced 24-hour operations. It developed increasingly sophisticated ordering systems. It integrated suppliers and delivery networks. And it began treating individual products and individual stores as data problems. By the 1980s, 7-Eleven Japan had introduced POS systems and increasingly sophisticated information systems. It was also developing highly coordinated delivery systems, including multiple daily deliveries of prepared rice products. This difference would become crucial because the American company had invented the basic idea, but Japan was becoming exceptionally good at operating it. Imagine two students being given the same business idea. One invents the concept. The other takes it apart, studies every component, and rebuilds it into a more sophisticated machine. That was increasingly the relationship between Southland and its Japanese licensee. And then came the 1980s. This was supposed to be the era when 7-Eleven became unstoppable. Instead, it became the beginning of the company's greatest crisis. The problem wasn't that 7-Eleven had stopped growing. The problem was that Southland had become much more than 7-Eleven. The company had expanded into other businesses. It had acquired Chief Auto Parts. It owned dairies. It had invested heavily in food processing. And in 1983, Southland bought Citgo Petroleum for roughly $780 million, hoping to secure a reliable source of gasoline for its convenience stores. But the oil business proved far more difficult than expected. Southland eventually sold half of Citgo to Venezuela's state-owned oil company in 1986. The company was getting bigger, but bigger didn't necessarily mean healthier. And then Wall Street came calling. By the middle of the 1980s, Southland had become a takeover target. A Canadian businessman, Samuel Bellsberg, was threatening a hostile takeover. The Thompson family, descendants of 7-Eleven's founder, didn't want to lose control of the company. So they came up with a solution. They would buy the company themselves. The mechanism was a leveraged buyout. The basic idea behind an LBO is simple. Borrow enormous amounts of money to buy a company, then use the company's assets and future cash flow to help pay off the debt. It can work. If the business produces enough cash, the debt gets paid down and the owners end up with a valuable company. But if things go badly, the debt doesn't disappear. It gets heavier. And Southland was about to discover just how heavy it could become. In 1987, the Thompson family and management arranged a multi-billion-dollar leveraged buyout. The final transaction was approved at approximately $4.9 billion, financed with roughly $2.2 billion in high-yield bonds and $2.6 billion in bank loans. The family had successfully protected the company from a hostile takeover. But they had also transformed the company's balance sheet. Southland now had an enormous debt burden, and suddenly, businesses that had once seemed like valuable diversification became things that could be sold for cash. Chief Auto Parts was sold, the dairy business was sold, other divisions were sold. Real estate was sold. About 1,000 convenience stores and related properties were among the assets divested as Southland tried to reduce the debt created by the buyout. The company was effectively dismantling pieces of itself to survive the transaction that had been designed to keep it independent. And then the economy turned against it. Southland struggled to service the debt. By 1989, the company could no longer comfortably meet its obligations. Negotiations with creditors dragged on. Eventually, there was no elegant solution left. Southland filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in October 1990. Think about how bizarre this situation was. The company behind one of the most successful retail concepts in American history was bankrupt. 7-Eleven wasn't failing because people had stopped wanting convenience. People still wanted Slurpees. They still wanted big gulps. They still wanted late-night snacks. The stores still had customers. The problem was financial. The company had taken on too much debt, and now the people who could save it were not in Dallas. They were in Japan. By 1990, the Japanese 7-Eleven operation had become an extraordinarily successful business in its own right. And its relationship with Southland was no longer merely that of a licensee paying for the right to use an American brand. The Japanese business had become a major force within the 7-Eleven system. When Southland entered bankruptcy, Ito-Yokado and 7-Eleven Japan stepped forward. In March 1991, the Japanese companies injected $430 million into Southland and acquired approximately 70% of its equity. Southland emerged from Chapter 11, and control of the company passed away from the Thompson family that had founded it. This was not a hostile conquest. It was a rescue, and that distinction matters. The company wasn't simply purchased because Japan wanted an iconic American brand. The Japanese partners had a long-standing relationship with Southland. They already knew the business. They already operated thousands of 7-Eleven stores in Japan. And, perhaps most importantly, they had developed a different approach to convenience retail. Southland had created the concept. 7-Eleven Japan had refined it. Now that refinement was coming back to America. The new owners began restructuring the American business. Unprofitable locations were closed. Operations were streamlined. The company went back to its core business, convenience retail, and the Japanese management philosophy increasingly emphasized things like precise inventory control, store-level information, and coordinated distribution. The difference was almost philosophical. The old American model had asked, "What can we sell in this store?" The Japanese model increasingly asked, "What does this particular neighborhood want at this particular time, and how quickly can we get it into this particular store?" That distinction sounds small. It isn't. For a convenience store, it can be the difference between having a shelf full of products and having exactly the products customers want. And that was one of the secrets behind 7-Eleven Japan's success. The Japanese operation had not simply copied the American model, it had turned convenience into a highly engineered supply chain system. The company introduced increasingly sophisticated information technology. It tracked sales, it improved ordering, it coordinated deliveries, it treated stores as constantly changing snapshots of local demand. And eventually, the American parent was being rebuilt using ideas developed by the company that had once been its licensee. The relationship had completely reversed. The parent had become the student. The licensee had become the rescuer. But there was still one final step. For years after the 1991 rescue, 7-Eleven continued operating as an American retail company under Japanese ownership, but the ownership relationship kept evolving. In 2005, Ito-Yokado reorganized its businesses under a new holding company, 7&I Holdings. 7-Eleven Japan and the American 7-Eleven business were now part of a much larger Japanese retail group. And in November 2005, 7-Eleven Japan completed the process of bringing the American company under full ownership. The company that had begun in Dallas in 1927 was now ultimately controlled from Japan, and that makes the story of 7-Eleven almost perfectly circular. America invented the convenience store, Japan perfected the convenience store, then Japan rescued the American company that invented it. And eventually, Japan owned the brand. But there's another reason this story is so interesting. Because when most people think about 7-Eleven today, they probably don't think about any of this. They don't think about Ito-Yokado, they don't think about Chapter 11, they don't think about leveraged buyouts. They don't think about the Thompson family. And they definitely don't think about an ice house in 1920s Dallas. They think about a Slurpee, and that's actually the genius of the brand. The corporate history is complicated. The customer experience isn't. You walk in, you grab a drink, you grab something to eat. You pay, you leave. That's the entire promise. Convenience. And that simplicity is exactly why 7-Eleven survived a crisis that could have destroyed it. There is a temptation to describe this as the rise and fall of 7-Eleven, but that isn't quite accurate, because 7-Eleven didn't really fall. Southland did. That's an important distinction. The original corporate structure collapsed under debt. The founding family lost control. The company went through bankruptcy. Thousands of stores and pieces of the broader Southland empire were sold. But the 7-Eleven brand survived, and eventually it became larger than it had ever been. Today, 7-Eleven describes itself as the world's largest convenience retailer, with more than 86,000 stores across 19 countries and regions. So if you look at the story purely through the number of stores, the company didn't end in failure. It ended in transformation. The original American company had a problem. The Japanese operation helped solve it, and the resulting company became something neither side had originally planned, a global retail empire. And perhaps the most ironic part is that the Japanese company didn't destroy what made 7-Eleven American. It preserved it. The logo stayed, the name stayed, the Slurpee stayed, the Big Gulp stayed, the basic promise stayed, even the American headquarters remained in Texas. But behind that familiar storefront was a completely different corporate history, one that crossed the Pacific and back. So, what actually made 7-Eleven successful? It wasn't the Slurpee. It wasn't the Big Gulp. It wasn't even the famous 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. hours. Those were symptoms of a much bigger idea. 7-Eleven understood something about modern life before most retailers did. People don't always want to shop. Sometimes they just want something now. A gallon of milk, a cup of coffee, a cold drink, a snack, gas, a hot dog at 2 in the morning. The company built an entire business around that moment, and the idea was born in the most unlikely place imaginable. An ice house. A customer came looking for ice. Someone realized they might also want milk, then bread, then eggs, then beer, then coffee, then gasoline, then a frozen drink, then an absurdly large soda, and eventually the company realized that the thing it was really selling wasn't any of those products. It was immediacy. That's why 7-Eleven became so powerful, and that's also why the company's Japanese chapter matters so much. Because Japan didn't merely save a collection of stores, it demonstrated that convenience could be engineered. Data could tell you what a neighborhood wanted. Distribution could make sure the product arrived at exactly the right time. Technology could turn a tiny store into a highly responsive retail machine. And that philosophy helped transform the company after its American parent nearly collapsed. The irony is almost too perfect. The American company invented convenience. The Japanese company became better at it. Then the Japanese company rescued the American inventor, and eventually it bought the whole thing. There is one final detail that makes the story even stranger. 7-Eleven is still changing. It isn't some frozen relic from the 1980s. The company continues to expand, acquire other convenience store brands, introduce delivery services, loyalty programs, mobile technology, and new food products. The brand that once began by selling ice from a dock now operates tens of thousands of stores around the world. Even the products that made 7-Eleven famous have become institutions. The Slurpee has been around for 6 decades. The Big Gulp has been around for half a century. The company still builds marketing around them. still celebrates them, still uses them as symbols of the brand, and that is why the story isn't really about the death of 7-Eleven, it's about the death of one version of 7-Eleven. The original Southland Corporation is gone. The Thompson family's control is gone. The American ownership structure is gone. But the idea survived, and in a strange way, it became stronger. The company that started by making life easier for customers in Dallas eventually built one of the world's largest retail networks, and it did so after surviving one of the most dramatic corporate collapses in American retail history. So the next time you see that familiar orange, green, and red sign, remember what you're actually looking at. You're not just looking at an American convenience store, you're looking at the remains of a 1927 ice company. You're looking at a brand that survived a multi-billion-dollar leveraged buyout. You're looking at a company that went bankrupt. You're looking at a business rescued by the Japanese licensee it had once allowed to use its name. And you're looking at a brand that eventually became part of one of Japan's largest retail groups. The funny thing is, none of that changes what happens when you walk through the doors. The Slurpee is still cold. The Big Gulp is still ridiculously large. The fluorescent lights are still buzzing. And somewhere in the world, someone is still walking into a 7-Eleven because they need one thing, and walking out with 5. That was the idea born in Dallas nearly a century ago. And somehow, after everything that happened to the company that created it, that idea is still alive. Maybe that's the real rise and fall of 7-Eleven. It didn't fall. It changed hands. It crossed an ocean. It nearly died. And then it came back stronger. The American convenience store didn't disappear. Japan just ended up owning it.